Fiorella Isabel is an independent journalist, a political analyst, host of Fiorella Isabel and the Convo Couch, and she is a must-read, must-listen to anyone who wants to understand what's happening in the world. There's so much of the world that you cover that I don't know quite where to start. Let's start with Venezuela. The empire tried to find another Juan Guaido. They came up with someone who, for some bizarre reason, seemed to have a woman standing in his place, or was she really the candidate and he was the dummy? Who was the ventriloquist? Who was the dummy? Wasn't all that clear to me, but having declared, Blinken declared that somebody unknown to me was now the president of Venezuela, they've had to, in Washington parlance, walk that back. Is the empire giving up in Venezuela? Are they accepting the inevitable?
Well, I have to say that the things that are happening in Venezuela are very, very much reminiscent of how we have shifted into a new era of going towards multipolarity. Because if you recall in 2019, when Juan Guaido was named the interim president of Venezuela, the United States had far more support. In fact, they had the support of several Latin American countries involving the Lima Group, which are several countries that came together to oppose Maduro and basically try to remove him from office. And so what we're seeing now is that a few years later, things have greatly shifted, because the United States is no longer able to act as a bully in this unipolar world. Immediately, who recognized Venezuela's results? Russia, China, much of Latin America. In fact, you had other countries that had been resisting and fighting U.S. imperialism, U.S. Coup attempts like Honduras quickly come and say, we support Venezuela. Nicaragua, same thing. And on top of that, what ended up happening was you had countries like Brazil come into the fold, Mexico, and back up Venezuela and say, hands off Venezuela, Venezuela's sovereignty must be respected. So now you're seeing that geopolitical shift in the entire world be reflected on the events happening in Venezuela. You're also seeing another situation that's developed for the United States, as you mentioned earlier, right? We have the conflict in Ukraine that's going not well for the US and NATO. You have a lot of weaknesses being exposed there. And then, of course, we have what's going on with Israel, the impending attack from Iran, Israel's exposure to the world as a failed Zionist entity, a failed project. You have the fact that the genocide in Gaza cannot be ignored, even though people are desperately trying to ignore it in the first world. And so you see that now reflected in the fact that the United States cannot continue overextending itself. It has yet failed again in this other coup attempt, because also they've had to, as you mentioned, backtrack, moonwalk their initial recognition of Gonzalez, Edmundo Gonzalez, who, as you mentioned, he's just the puppet being mastered by Maria Corina Machado, who is the one that is behind the scenes, also a Zionist, by the way, has been manipulating this whole thing, because he, like Biden, can barely move around, barely utter words. But behind him, of course, is the United States, the opposition. Maduro called it out himself. He himself said the United States is behind these attempts to overthrow Venezuela, to overthrow their legitimate government. And he also signaled the amount of money that many of these protesters that were trying to reinvigorate the guarimbas of 2017 were paid $150 a day to push this violent scenario, to make it look like Venezuela is very destabilized, to make it look like it needs help from the United States, which is, of course, this modus operandi of the intelligence. And then, of course, it didn't work. And so I think what we have seen is a reflection of the changing of the times in Venezuela. And of course, they're going to continue. You have John Bolton saying we need to reestablish the Lima Group in order to get rid of Maduro, fully flat out calling this out. But I think it's going to be very difficult for all the reasons that I just mentioned.
As a metaphor for the dying of empire, this failed coup d'etat, not the first one, not even the fifth one, in Venezuela, will do. It's a very good one. But the metaphor for me is the imbecilic President Joe Biden lying on a deck chair. He has spent 45% of his presidency on vacation. And oddly, he thinks it's a good look for the photographers to be able to see him lying on a deck chair from which he cannot get up without the assistance of his G-men. And cackling Kamala Harris, Kama Chameleon, giggling around the stages of the United States, seeking to renew the Biden-Harris mandate, but with Harris in the top position. And the shambling, shuffling, shambolic figure of Donald Trump in his new persona, lisping away with Elon Musk in a 2-hour ramble on Twitter. And I look at this picture of American political power and I compare and contrast it with the vigor of Maduro, with the vigor of Putin, with the sagacity of the Chinese leadership. And I realize I'm looking at rising powers and looking at the declining powers they are leaving in their wake. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And when we're talking about the comparison between the United States political leadership or lack thereof, and then we look at Putin, for example, and the trust that people have on him when it comes to foreign policy, especially when it comes to pulling Russia into a new era in spite of sanctions, in spite of everything. And you have Maduro, another man that's also a leader of a country that has endured numerous sanctions and also numerous attempts at overthrowing it, at overthrowing him from power and basically hurting Venezuelan people in the process, starving people initially, and then, of course, having people have to fight the propaganda where they said, in spite of everything, we're here, we're surviving, we're doing well. And fighting all of this almost psychological warfare is what they've called it. And the Venezuelan Defense Ministry themselves have talked about this. This is a psychological war, as well as it is an attempt, obviously, using these regime change operations. But the fact that we're seeing this comparison, I think should open people's eyes more. As you mentioned, we saw Elon Musk and Donald Trump hold a conversation, and even though Donald Trump right now seems as the lesser of evils, one thing is certain, that U.S. presidents change, and I'm sure you know this, but the foreign policy remains the same. When we're looking at the next potential location for the theaters, we're looking at Iran. The United States, I disagree with some people saying otherwise, the United States does want a war with Iran. They are salivating. The Conservative Party wants it. The Democrats want it. When you look at how they are targeting Iran for everything, whether it's for what's happening in Gaza, for what's happening with Lebanon, for what's happening even in Venezuela, those ties between Iran and Venezuela, you're looking at a country that wants to use any excuse, perhaps any sort of false flag operation, perhaps something that can convince the American public to go to war with Iran. I saw that reflected in the conversation between Elon Musk and Donald Trump when they're talking about the immigration issue. Now, immigration is a huge problem in the United States. That is a fact. However, the way it was being phrased was, oh, all these people from Venezuela are coming in, and all these people, these Arabs are coming in. That is what it was said in that conversation. And some of these people, they might try to do something. I see that as being formulated as an attempt to get, number one, the people in the U.S. to come against one another, maybe in some sort of riot, civil conflict, whatever that may be. Number two, in an attempt to, of course, allow the support for intervention and war with Iran. And I think that's happening both in the United States as well as in the UK and Europe, with different, of course, differences in the intricacies of each. But what we're seeing here is the focusing on the other one once again, instead of course, focusing on the failures of the government. The United States is a failed state. We have a failed infrastructure. We have a declining in a lifespan. We have a decline in the way people live. We have an inability to have a first world type of leadership and people that exist, because we have so much abundance, yet all of that abundance is being thrown away. And we are left with a population that is addicted to drugs, a population that is houseless. And none of these things are being talked about. What's being talked about is, who are we blaming? Are we blaming Iran? Now it's Iran interfering in the elections against Donald Trump, right? A few years ago, it was Russia. It is as ludicrous to think that Iran is interfering in U.S. elections as it was to think that Russia was interfering in ours.
Well, you know, Venezuela, as you very well know, has billions more barrels of oil under its land and water than Saudi Arabia does. That's what first attracted the American empire to Venezuela. Iran is oil and gas rich, now a nuclear power with its own nuclear power plants generating like billion. Russia, the biggest country in the world, is the country that has everything. It literally has everything, except arguably enough people, which is why so many of us are thinking of emigrating there. They are giving away land to people who will move there. But the biggest country in the world, with the biggest collection of actual wealth, the things that we actually need, whilst our economies are sinking, failing, flailing, and our political class, miniature as it is, seems to have no idea how we are going to get out of this. And if the best idea, my dear wise lady, is either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, then I suggest that we have already lost. How do people follow your work, Fiorella?
Well, people can find me on X or Twitter at Fiorella Isabel M. You can also find me on Telegram at Fiorella in Moscow, or Rumble under Fiorella Isabel. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.